Welcome, everyone. It's really nice to have you here. This is one of the programs in our series, Contemporary Questions about the Historic Circus. And today we're shining a spotlight on a special exhibition that's currently on view in our Historic Circus Museum that was curated by Lacie Barbour, who's here with us today under the supervision of Jennifer Lemmer Posey, who's our curator of circus. And what I'd like to do is introduce the two of them, and then I'll show a couple of installation shots that I took on my phone, so they're not super high quality, but they'll give you a sense of the exhibition if you haven't been in that space yet. And then we'll let Lacie kind of explain the project on a holistic level about, kind of the big themes that she is working to draw out in the show. She'll show a couple of her favorite objects that are featured, and then we'll have a discussion and we'll just talk about what the process was like, some of the key considerations that had to be made in undertaking an exhibition of this nature. So Lacie, do you want to introduce yourself and say hi?
Yeah, sure. Hey guys, I'm Lacie. I don't know if I've met any of you before, but I graduated in April with my master's in Museum and Cultural Heritage Studies. I got my undergrad at Southeastern Louisiana University in art history, and I hope to curate modern and contemporary art someday, but I had an internship at the Ringling Museum where I curated the show.
Awesome, thanks. And we'll be hearing lots more from Lacie in just a moment. And Jennifer Lemmer Posey, a familiar face to all, much loved around here, but if you want to just kind of say hi.
Yes, hi everybody. It's nice to see you all again. I'm just excited to do this program with Lacie because it was a learning curve for me as well about how to try and work with a student in a way that has a real result, something tangible that you get to walk away with. And is something that can be public facing and, a good experience all around, which this whole process working through the extraordinary bodies really was. So I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Excellent. So like I said, I'm going to just show you a few images. If you haven't been in the space, I guess we can ask how many of you have actually seen this exhibition in the Historic Circus Museum or spent just a little bit of time there? Maybe not. Okay, well, great. I will show you virtually then. And again, I apologize for the quality of the photos. They were just things I shot on my phone when I was in there one day. But this is sort of the title wall. The title of the exhibition, as you can see, is Extraordinary Bodies. And I love this, that Lacie and Jennifer came up with, beginning the introduction to the exhibition with questions, right? There's this sort of interrogation that we're asked to think through as visitors to the show about what does it mean to be normal? What are these cultural norms that we've come to sort of take for granted? What do we do when someone defies our expectations of quote unquote normality? So I love that right off the bat, this is meant to be a very probing and thought-provoking exhibition. And then as you go through, it's just in this one gallery here. If you're familiar with the Historic Circus Museum, this used to be the space that showcased the greatest show on earth. No, not the greatest show on earth.
It was, yes.
It was, yes, the greatest show on earth with the memorabilia and the film and everything. But now it's transformed. It looks so beautiful. So you'll see there are different examples here of prints from the collection. And again, I'll just move through these sort of quickly just to give you a sense. And each one is accompanied by a label text that was written by Lacie that really tells the story of these individuals, or at least helps us put them in context. And there is one case of sort of ephemera, and maybe Lacie can talk a little bit more about that as well. So that's visually the exhibition in a nutshell. But I want to turn it over to Lacie, and I will spotlight you, Lacie, so everybody can see you, to talk a little bit about the themes in the exhibition, sort of the big picture messages that you were hoping to get across.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So for this exhibition, Extraordinary Bodies, we wanted to have a conversation about the history of human exhibitions and spectacles for commercial entertainment, while exploring all of the nuances that sometimes get left out of those conversations. So for some context of the show, the Enlightenment era in Europe, which was starting around the early 1700s, sparked an interest in science and reason, which led to new forms of public exhibition and entertainment, which included human displays. So these people on display typically had bodies that varied from the norms. They were labeled as monsters, wonders, curiosities, oddities, and freaks. The displays occurred at fairs, markets, street corners, royal courts, and were depicted in books and popular prints, which is seen in the illustrations featured in this exhibition. And these displays were the precursors of the modern sideshow that we see a lot of in relation to the circus, which is why it's happening in the Historic Circus Museum. So a huge theme in this show is the act of questioning what constitutes normal, like Laura said, and how society has treated people who don't embody those specific traits. So these individuals were often cast in problematic ways and sometimes even stripped of their identity. We made a point to include the topic of free will and discuss the power dynamics between the audience and the subjects, which we're continuing by presenting these prints to the public in this way. So now you guys and me and everyone who visits the gallery are the audience once again. So we really wanted to share this history and the stories of some of these people in a way that could rehumanize them, which can be difficult because there's always potential for museums to further exploit these people who had a complex relationship with agency in the first place. So we'll talk a bit more about that, like in depth, and how we kind of navigated creating this exhibition surrounding all of those important topics. But first, I'll tell you guys a little bit about some of my favorite pieces. And there were so many, and it's so hard to choose just a few, but this one that you guys see right now that Laura has up is of Mr. Matthew Buchinger, and he was believed to have done this print himself. So he's one of the more widely known of the subjects featured in this exhibition because he gained a lot of popularity while he was alive, and his illustrations have been reproduced over and over the last few hundred years. So Matthias Buchinger was born in Germany in 1674 without hands or most of his legs, so he was only 29 inches tall. He was known as the Little Man of Nuremberg, but also for having amazing dexterity, which allowed him to draw, master multiple instruments. He could write. So, I mean, this is really amazing work. So he eventually, reluctantly, started to exhibit himself, and he sold his drawings to support his family because that was his only option at the time. In this self-portrait, he uses a method called mycography. So it's drawing using small words to kind of form the images, and you can see in the curls of his wig, if you had a magnifying glass, it's really tiny, that he wrote out 7 complete psalms. Oh, wow, I didn't know you could do that. That's great. He wrote out 7 psalms and the Lord's Prayer, all within the curls of his wigs, which is really amazing. But his story is so important, and I wanted to talk about this one because it brings up the topic of agency. Yes, he chose to exhibit himself, but only because the society that he found himself a part of really wasn't set up for him to financially succeed in other ways. And his artistry was often overshadowed by his physical appearance, despite the large body of work that he created. But in 2016, the Metropolitan Museum of Art actually included a large portion of his work in an exhibition titled Wordplay at the Met, the drawings of Matthias Buchinger, which celebrates him as an artist and calligrapher rather than just a human spectacle. So that's not like in the label at the show, but it's something that I found out and I really loved that. So I wanted to share that with you guys. And then the next print, if you want to go to the next one, Laura. Thank you. So this one that I want to talk to you guys about is titled The Hungarian Conjoined Twins, Ilona and Judith, more popularly known as Judith and Helen. So they were born as conjoined twins in 1701, but their thoughts, feelings, preferences, and health, all of that was independent. And they were exhibited throughout Europe when they were young girls in the care of this Hungarian physician, Susie. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And the whole time that they were exhibited, they were examined by physiologists and anatomists for their bodies because it was just so extraordinary at the time. They didn't really understand how it worked. But after being exhibited for a few years, the Cardinal Archbishop of Hungary grew concerned for their well-being while traveling, and he took them from Susie's care and sent them to live in a convent when they were like around 9 or 10 years old. And while they were being exhibited, Susie had flyers made with their image to announce their exhibition and sell tickets and things like that. That anatomical portrait was adapted decades after their death to be featured as monsters in this book, Buffon's Histoire Naturelle, or Natural History. The artist inverted the original engraving. He aged the young girls and created a genre scene with the twins holding towels in the bedroom, which is what you see here. So this is not the original portrait created for them. It is a more creative version to put in this book decades later. So it's interesting that even after the exhibition stopped and the girls were taken from the public, their image was reproduced and altered for the public to consume with fascination. And then the relationship that conjoined twins have with each other, I think, can be hard for people to imagine that don't have the same lived experience. It brings up so many other conversations about identity, things like self-expression, pronouns, partners, and privacy that we can't really understand because we just can't relate. And in the past and even now, the relationship between us, the audience, including medical professionals, especially now, and conjoined twins has this extra layer to it. So many people at the time speculated on how to separate Judith and Ilona surgically and couldn't fathom the fact that they actually wanted to stay conjoined. And it's a good example of how we tend to project our own experiences and preferences onto those who don't conform to societal expectations, rather than seeking to understand and accept their own experience and their own preferences. And it's something that we still see today, and maybe even more so now with all of like the treatments and cures or just more accessible remedies that could potentially alter some of the conditions mentioned in the exhibition. There can be this pressure, I think, to change and conform to be more normal or as normal as possible. And that just brings us back to the question about who's in power to create those parameters. But anyway, there's so much to talk about with each and every one of these prints, so we can talk more about all of that good stuff. And I'll go on to the next one. So lastly, I want to talk about Mademoiselle La Forte. She was born in France in 1799 and was first exhibited in 1819 in London as a bearded lady. Her image was widely distributed, but there's little information about her true life or her name. She usually advertised herself as Mademoiselle or Miss, but I found an interesting quote in Kirby's magazine of remarkable characters that she was featured in. And someone who saw her exhibition describes her as well, they say that the audience was at a loss whether to describe this human being by the term masculine or feminine. So equally blended are the sexes that it is impossible to say which has the predominance. So in her performances, she wore dresses and played up her femininity, but when seen in passing on the streets, she usually wore like pants, trousers, and more masculine clothing. And I really love her story because her body already didn't conform to traditional gender stereotypes and appearances, but on top of that, she actively chose not to alter her physical appearance and used fashion to subvert societal expectations. She could have easily shaved her face and opted for feminine dress to fit in with society, but instead she chose to express herself ambiguously. And we can't really say for sure if this was something she would have done just for self-expression, but she certainly did so to make money and to make a livable wage. And she came to profit off of society's fascination with bodies that disrupted this accepted construct of a very strict gender binary. And this one is particularly interesting to me because, I mean, in relation to current conversations surrounding gender that is happening all over right now, I think we as a society are moving away from that binary, but there are absolutely still expectations for the way that people present themselves. There are stereotypes and prejudices for sure. And those who don't conform to that are often pointed out and talked about. So it's interesting to see that we're still having similar conversations about what normal is and the way that people are treated because of that. So yeah, that's just a little bit of what's on display in the galleries.
Lacie, thank you so much. You've laid such a rich groundwork for a discussion that I was going to first talk about sort of how the project came about, but I'm wondering maybe we can just dive right into some of these big ideas you've presented to us that are present in the exhibition. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see you and see Jennifer. So maybe we could just start with this kind of big question about what kind of considerations did you and Jennifer make in developing this show, thinking about those ideas of spectacle, agency, exploitation? How were you careful to ensure that your display of these images and the telling of these stories was done respectfully? And I guess, you know, thinking to this long history and trajectory of people being exhibited, where is that line between exhibition and exploitation? And how did you, again, ensure that it was done really respectfully? So that's a huge question. And I will throw it to you and Jennifer to talk sort of through how you did it so well and what kind of considerations you made.
Yeah, so I feel like that was the trickiest part of curating this specific show, especially because we were using the same materials that would have been used by these people exhibiting them in the first place. So it felt like it was going to be really tricky. We knew that from the start. And we kept asking ourselves this every step of the way. How are we making sure that we're not further exploiting these people? How are we making sure that we're not causing more harm to these people? Because even if your intentions are coming from a good place, you know, that's not enough. I think a lot of exhibitions, the ideas, the people, they're coming from a good place, and the audience doesn't necessarily know that, and they can kind of interpret it in their own way. So you really have to be careful and think about that. Obviously, this was my first show, and I have a very long way to go when it comes to that. But we really wanted to rehumanize them, and there was like these moments of how can we do that respectfully and gracefully. Which I'm thankful I had Jennifer to guide me in the right direction. But I think for me personally, it took being open to criticism and, like, I guess being humble in a way of admitting and accepting I don't have all of the answers. And I also am the one in power now. So that dynamic shifted. And then really to not shy away from some of the harder conversations that we easily could have been like, okay, maybe this doesn't shine a positive light on the circus or museums or exhibitions in general, but a lot of it was rooted in racism, was rooted in sexism, was rooted in colonialism. And in order to honor those stories, you have to talk about those hard concepts.
Yeah, so I am even at the moment, Lacie, I knew this, but like I totally threw you in the deep end on an incredibly difficult topic. It was one that it was important to me even before Lacie approached me for a project. This idea was on my radar because we have this huge collection of prints that represent anomalous bodies. And why do we have them if we're not sharing them? How do we share them in a way that makes for good conversation and not just opinions? I mean, one can look at this history of displaying people and call it wrong and bad, but that's oversimplifying too. So I knew that I wanted to do something along these lines. And so when Lacie was looking for a project, I kind of tossed this to her, and what she did from the start was dive right into the bigger contextual ideas, like the bigger abstract and theoretical questions of what does it mean to stare at people. She did the research, reading up on Rosemary Garland Thompson and other scholars who are looking into how culture deals with anomalous bodies. And then, and we should come back to this for this particular group, because there's the question of picking out the content that you want. And then there's the reality of museum work, wherein the stuff you want may not be something you can exhibit because of a lot of other things. So Lacie had to navigate that process to come up with a checklist that we could consider, and then do the writing, which brought it back to individual stories. And I think that's the greatest strength of this exhibit, is that the larger framing text gives you big questions, like Laura said. It makes us think right from the start. And then if you're thinking about those things as you read the true stories of these people, the lives they lived, some cases, there was very clearly agency and benefit, and then others, the story of the conjoined twins, Helen and Judith, always gets me, because the fact that they're depicted nude when they were not seen at that age in that condition. I mean, their image was just taken by people and used whatever way they wanted. So the lack of agency there, trying to formulate all of these and have a nice interplay of those stories is a huge challenge for anyone. And Lacie came up with a checklist that does that beautifully, and then the space came together so well. So it's a big process to navigate.
Thank you. And I want to hone in on a specific part of the project, which is writing the labels, really fine tuning the language. The exhibition itself is called Extraordinary Bodies. Another term, Jennifer, you and I have been using, is variable bodies. And then I think kind of more traditionally, it's people with disabilities, but I think moving outside of that framework, it's just bodies that are different. I think, Jennifer, you just used another term, and I'm forgetting what it was.
Anomalous bodies.
Anomalous bodies. Yeah. So the language that is being used, I think, and I know because we went through many different drafts of writing and, collaboration and conversation, but even just sort of active versus passive voice, was this person exhibited or did they exhibit themselves? Every little nuance to the language. So can you talk a little bit about how you came to, first of all, call the exhibition Extraordinary Bodies, and then maybe what the process was like for you, Lacie, and for you, Jennifer, and advising on really honing in on that perfect label text?
Do you want me to start a little bit with the title, Lacie, and then you'll chime in, because I think we changed a little. We had originally had it as variable bodies, because I'm so excited about that term. I love this language. We've been working with a number of scholars from New College and other schools internationally, looking at disability studies and the kind of language one uses. And Professor Chris Munsey out of the University of Winchester coined this term variable bodies. And what he looks at it as is much like we were talking about with the stories of the individuals in the prints, that each body is unique. So each story is unique. And if we use that approach to every single body, what we term disability just becomes that person's reality. And what we term exceptional ability, like for me, it's thinking about flying trapeze artists. What they can do is something exceptional too, but then it is a spectrum of experience. It's not, there aren't these positive, negative connotations. So we'd started there. But in some senses, because there was so much focus on bodies of difference, anomalous bodies, with this, I think that was where we started moving, Lacie. Extraordinary Bodies was where we landed, because it felt like it had some of the same weight to it, that, that there was this idea that this body should be celebrated for what it is and not judged. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, that's kind of where I got to, because I think in the past, a lot of these people, their stories can seem a bit negative, and so in rehumanizing them, we also wanted to celebrate them. And I think that's, for me, why I was drawn to the word extraordinary, because they are extraordinary, and the lens that we view them from is ableist. It's our own personal lived experience. And I think when we shift that language to extraordinary, we can start to view everything a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And then I guess I'll talk a little bit about the label writing too, which was so difficult. I started out just wanting to get all of the facts down for my research. So like Jennifer said, I started with these two books, which I need to return to you. like at some point. I've been meaning to forever, but I started with freakery, the cultural spectacles of the extraordinary body, which there's that word again, and then also staring, how we look. So I used those to kind of introduce me to the circus and sideshows and exhibitions in general. And then after we chose the prints from the show, that's when I started really researching their individual stories, the prints themselves, the makers, where the image originated, what it was used for, and just trying to get all of those details out for every single print. And wanting to tell their stories gracefully and respectfully whenever these people didn't really always have agency. I was mindful of making sure that I was only sharing information that I think was gotten through agency, I guess. It's kind of hard to explain, but I didn't want to share information about their lives that they probably wouldn't have wanted to share themselves. There was sensitive information regarding a lot of these people that I didn't feel necessary to understand for the show. And I mean, since you guys are students and you'll probably, I'm not sure what your interests are in, but if you're writing labels yourselves, like something that I found that I was struggling with was the language surrounding this community that I myself am not a part of. I'm clearly not an expert. And so just to like be transparent, there were absolutely phrases that I was using that I have heard my entire life that are just like a part of the way that we speak about people who are different. Things like people suffering from a condition, and writing that out and having people point out like that's not the way that's not the most respectful way to talk about these kind of things. And it's like, yeah, it was a true learning experience. And I think we had to be mindful about all of that when talking about these people. Because we don't want to, like, these people are long gone, but there are also so many communities, there are so many individuals who still relate to this. And so we're not only like trying to respect the people in these prints, but also like the people who will be visiting the show too.
Yeah, and I think, ultimately it's modeling good language too. It was a learning curve for staff as well, because like Lacie, I don't self-identify within this community. And so thinking about some of those words, I had to really slow myself down, and read through and think about how does that go? I have a dear family friend who uses a wheelchair, and it's been one of those lessons for me. Like, he is not in a wheelchair. That, yes, that is physically the truth. He is in it, but empowering, as Laura said, not using passive voice is really important in all of this. So you do have to slow everything down. And as museum professionals, in whatever path you take, we are moderating information for a big general audience. So you want to give good, respectful information. But I do think in some ways it's that modeling then, forward. If we all chip away at using language in these thoughtful ways, then hopefully that will start infiltrating broadly and start making a difference in a sense. And that's, I feel that dynamic. I mean, this one exhibition has certainly shaped what will happen going forward as I deal with these topics in our galleries. And it's, learning from this and learning about how to be considerate about language and how to broadly tap a community to help you read through it. I mean, these were not labels that went on the wall with just one person's editing. We got input from all over the place because we wanted to be thoughtful.
Thank you both so much. And I think we couldn't have asked for better stewards of this exhibition or the story than the two of you. So Lacie, earlier you mentioned, using the term extraordinary, really shining sort of a positive light on a lot of these stories, but I know you're also very cognizant of telling the real truth, even when that truth is difficult. Were there instances where you came across problematic material for whatever reason and ultimately decided that exhibiting it would do more harm and you pulled it? Or are there maybe examples in some of the individual stories where there's some gap in our knowledge and maybe there's more to explore. Just sort of, what are the untapped sort of ideas around the difficult side of this history that you had to grapple with in this exhibition?
Yeah, so there were a few problematic facets of some of the stories, specifically with like titles of some of the prints that were still titled things that were probably said in this way before before modern language was, a thing. So there was some titles that we ended up changing for the show that was problematic, but there was one piece specifically that whenever I was going through the online database, because that's what started the process for choosing what went into the show. It was just me scrolling through the online database and looking through the archives and like, okay, what's interesting to me? What stands out to me? And there was this piece of a young boy and his body that was exhibited. And after doing some research, I found out that his body was exhibited after he died. And so there was no way for him to consent to that. And it was a tragic death. And so I felt like there wasn't a way for me to show that to the public in a respectful way, because you can't guarantee that people are going to read it. We didn't know anything about his life because he didn't become a spectacle until after his death. And so we talked about including it just to say, like, look at how fascinated we are with other people's bodies, that these are the links that we'll go to, like even after death, we'll still share this for public entertainment and public fascination. But I think that by showing that print, we would have still been doing that exact same thing. And so we chose not to put it in the show. I think the best way to honor him would be to like sit with it and not put it out there into the public. So it wasn't really a tough decision because I felt like it wasn't right to share it in my gut. And that's what I went with. But there were plenty of situations where it was difficult. Like this was part of their life, and I want the facts to be there, but you don't want to overshare, I think, in some ways and be disrespectful. But then when it comes down to like the racism in Genevieve's case, which is a print of a young woman with albinism who was looked at through a racist and colonial lens, and then also an indigenous family. Those were things that was like, okay, this is very obviously in the print that we have to talk about. We can't shy away from that. And that's just the reality of it. So those are difficult conversations, but I don't think they're as difficult for me just because I see them more as this is the reality, this is fact, and museums aren't neutral. So, we have to talk about that history of museums and exhibiting people, and yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to see this in an abstract form when we're talking, online, but what Lacie did as well was made some real curatorial choices about how the prints were displayed in the gallery space. So there are groupings that are topical, and we discussed at the time whether there should be kind of like, chat labels about these subjects, but it's one gallery. There's only so much space, and we decided if people were going to read, and we wanted them to read the individual stories. And so by creating groupings and kind of weaving themes into the labels for each group, Lacie covered some of these questions of agency and of twins and some of the kind of perceptions that people have about twins in general and conjoined twins specifically. So those little themes got teased out a little bit in the choices for the installation. And so kind of going back to the young boy, that print, it was visually a really compelling piece. It's one of the places that gets a little bit hard as somebody who loves art history to say, like if we could just look at this as an object, if we could just talk about the values and the way that it's rendered, it's quite lovely. But but we do history within the Circus Museum, and something like that is so, that's such a touchstone. It would never just be about the print. And we did talk about including it as a way to get into the idea of the absolute lack of agency. But within that little gallery space, it either had to stand by itself because it did not thematically group with anything, or it felt like it was going to be kind of abandoned, or we didn't feel like we could give it a special enough moment to encourage people to do the thinking that, as Lacie indicated, that needed to happen. So it was a particularly interesting point to work through, though, because there was a lot of compelling reasons to want to include it. And that's one of the hardest lessons of curating for me, is that, like, sometimes no matter how much you want it, it really just doesn't make good sense.
So, lessons of curating, Jennifer. Let's talk a little bit about the process now. I wanted to dive right into the kind of meaty questions of the show, but I also want, especially for the benefit of the students who are on this call today, talk about how did this all come about? What was the project like? So I guess a question for both of you is, and you've alluded to this a little bit, but how did you develop the content? Did you start out with a really specific goal or thesis in mind, or did the archives lead you to new discoveries and new conclusions? So maybe you can talk a little bit about how that all came to be. And I know, Jennifer, you said you had been wanting to explore this for a while, but how did you know it was the right time to do it? And how did you know it'd be a good fit for Lacie to work on?
So I'll start, but I think Lacie gets to do the bulk of this part. It was just something I wanted to work on because these pieces were in our collection. We've been doing the work with the academic side on the Variabilities Conference, and from the time that I've taken this position, one of the things I most want to do is open up difficult discourse. It's really important to me. There are a lot of topics in circus that people get very worked up about. And rather than hiding from those topics, I want to create thoughtful exhibitions or programs like we're doing here that give an opportunity to think about it and maybe broaden people's opinions. So it was something I really was dedicated to and wanted to have happen. I was also incredibly short on time and didn't necessarily see where I was going to fit it into my days. And so when Lacie reached out looking for a good project to work on, I kind of threw this out as a possibility. I think I may have thrown this and the possibility of just figuring out a rotation of prints in general, but that lacked shape and form. This was, there was a specific topic to cover, but beyond that, I think I pointed you towards like a set of image files on eMuseum and said, go.
Yeah. Yeah, so I had no idea what I was doing for my internship. And Jennifer had, I guess, spoke in one of our classes with David and mentioned that she had been wanting to do a project like this. And even though I was, focused on art history and wanting to work with the art museum, a lot of my work focuses on like highlighting marginalized artists and people. And so, and diversity, which Jennifer and I have talked about a lot about, diversity being inherent in the things that we want to talk about. And so this seemed like a good idea to maybe talk to her about. And so whenever she told me, okay, this is kind of what I'm thinking, this is the conference that's coming up, I thought, this is perfect. Like, I know nothing about the circus, but I will learn it because I think that this is an important conversation. And it's the kind of conversation that I want to have in like my career in the future concerning art. So I was a little nervous going into it just because I didn't know anything about the circus. I didn't know anything about this content, but Jennifer pointed me to these two books that helped out so much and just got me thinking about the questions that I needed to be asking, because my first approach was, okay, I'm coming at this historically. I want to talk about the history of exhibiting people. And then I read these books and I was like, okay, this is no longer about the history. Like this is about all of these like deeper conversations that need to happen. So anyway, as I was looking through the online database of like a few hundred prints, I guess, I was just looking at which ones interested me, which ones stood out, that I would like look forward to researching. And so we kind of had the main themes or bigger questions, but we didn't really know where that was going to lead us. And Jennifer kind of left it up to me to figure that out. What did I want to talk about? What did I think was important to talk about for the show? And so it was really easy once I found out, you know, the individual stories, because it's all right there for you. And it was kind of like magical, learning and unearthing all of these people's stories. It felt like I was, you know, honoring them by learning them and retelling them.
So there was a kind of nuts and bolts aspect to it too, though, because Lacie would come back with a list of, you know, this is a group of prints. We knew that we could fit somewhere in the ballpark of 18 prints. Like you know, it was depending on size and how they grouped, but we knew it needed to be a fairly small checklist. And so she would come with that. And, you know, the work starts digitally because that way you can get through a ton of material and not harm things. But you don't really know if you really like that thing until you're standing in front of it. So then we went and pulled prints and looked at the prints together and thought about how does this work? And then as that list got more and more refined, then we had to bring in our colleagues, you know, from conservation to make sure that they were okay with us using the prints, that the condition was good. Because it's one of my lessons in life is I never get too attached to anything until conservation is weighed in, because you know, ultimately their concern is the welfare of the object, and we have to honor that. And with timelines, sometimes you just don't have the time to have conservation work done. So we went through that, and then working with prep about how would these lay out together? Will this work? Help us see what it looks like in the space. So, you know, and so Lacie's simultaneously tracking the physical realities of how the space shapes up with how do the ideas and themes play together. It's one of the fun games of curating, I think, is trying to get all of those moving pieces to come into one vision, which in this case, it really did all just fit together perfectly.
Yeah, it definitely felt like we were building a puzzle or something, especially working with the other teams, which was so fun, working with prep and watching Glenn like set up a virtual like model of what the show was going to look like so we could place them around the gallery, and working with the conservation team to check the objects. We really wanted to put this robe in the show so bad, but textiles are tricky. So, but that goes back to not being attached to things. And yeah, so it was so valuable for me to work with all of those people and kind of see their process too, because I think it's important to work with them throughout the entire process, especially when you don't know anything about how it works, obviously. So that was a lot of fun. And then getting to actually help install the show was really special too. So Jennifer, I believe, was out of town, and so I helped hang the frames and the like labels and things like that, and just making those decisions about, okay, where is it going to go? What makes the most sense? Bringing the bench in so that people could sit in the space and really like meditate on these works. So the installation process was a lot of fun too, on top of just being able to curate it. And I did my capstone project on this show and my process. So if you guys, I'm sure you'll be doing a capstone pretty soon. If you guys want to see it, I can send it over to you. And it just lays out like every detail of the entire process, like step by step. So yeah.
So Lacie, it's nice that process has been documented as something we can pass down to the next generation of students. And it sounds like you learned so much about curating. Was there something in particular that you found the most surprising about the experience, or something you learned that was unexpected?
Yeah, so I feel like every step of the way was surprising, just because I did go into it with not a great idea of the content. So everything that I was learning content wise was like one surprise after the next. I didn't realize how deep and complex all of it was. But for me, about the process, the most surprising part was really how special it felt to, I guess, like be able to honor these people. I don't know if it's because it's my first show or if this happens every single time. I guess Jennifer can kind of talk about that. But for me, it just seems so precious. And I didn't expect that because, I mean, it's work. It's the work that I want to do. But I don't know. It just feels very special.
I love that, Lacie. It is exactly how I feel about my job. It's what keeps me doing what I'm doing. Is I feel beholden to a community that I'm telling stories for. Somehow I got to be their voice. You just experienced that. You somehow got to be a voice for people that would have never known that someone in the 21st century might even be sharing their stories. And how do we make it really respectful and special? And something that's relevant too, which I think, that comes across in the way you speak about it, as you always were thinking about how to bring it to this moment, as well as, be respectful of their history. It's the nice thing about history collections or history exhibitions, is that, the objects are important, but the stories are almost more important. So I was an objects person, and then suddenly I got this job, and now I'm all about the people and the stories.
Perfectly said.
So we have about 10 minutes left of the program. I want to stop asking you questions and let our audience ask questions. I do have a few more in my back pocket that I'm dying to know, but if we have time, I'll ask you those. But for those who are on the call, if you want to just unmute and ask any questions of Lacie or Jennifer, feel free.
Yeah, I guess I'll start off. I found your talk really interesting and very relevant as to just conversations as to how to exhibit without exploitation. I spent a year working in Cambodia at a museum that focused on the genocide history of Cambodia, but how to celebrate the people and not just dwell on that and cause trauma. So I found that your talk really spoke to that idea and other contexts of speaking about really hard, difficult, traumatic histories of people and the fact that they need to be shared, especially in safe face-saving cultures like in Southeast Asia, but in a very sensitive way that doesn't cause continuous harm to people groups. And so my question really comes out of that experience in my time there. But of a memory I have while being on the waterfront in Cambodia in a very highly tourist district area where sideshows still happen of young or children specifically is something that I noticed where there's a condition called macrocephaly, which causes infants to have very large heads. And I saw so many of these infants shown by, I don't know who, either by their parents or maybe by older people. And clearly these children don't have a say in if they're shown or not, yet they're being exploited on one hand to make money for their families. But it is very complicated because this is a way that families are supporting themselves by showing their children. So do you have any insight into the ethics of that? I never gave money because I didn't feel comfortable because of this internal war I couldn't figure out. But how do you approach current day sideshows that still occur of people who honestly don't have agency?
Yeah.
You want me to jump in, Lacie?
Well, I have just like a quick thought about it. I think that was what was really important about this show, is that we wanted to talk about that nuance. I mean, to say, is this ethical or not? It's impossible to answer yes or no, I think, because it's just complex. I mean, there's two sides to the story. It's not black and white. And so you have to be mindful of that. I don't think there's just one answer. And then also going back to the fact that these sideshows are still happening. Well, there are a lot of situations in where this fascination is still happening. It's might not be in sideshows, but in reality shows, just on TikTok, on all over the internet, I'm seeing still to this day people fascinated with those with different bodies. And so this fascination is not over. It's still something that we're talking about, that we're experiencing, which we bring up in the show as well. Shows like My 600-Pound Life, things like that we are just so intrigued by and curious about its human nature, and the way that we treat those people. It's changing in some ways for some people, but I think inherently, like, we are still just curious creatures. And this book, The Act of Staring, goes a lot into like how we can kind of shift that curiosity to be respectful, to ask questions, to encourage learning and understanding, rather than just, staring and viewing them as a spectacle and kind of dehumanizing them.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that we can do within the museum is, again, to make people ask good questions. And Lacie's exactly right. There's no right answer to that, is there? But I think you have to consider, the place and where they are economically. It brought to mind to me in the 1950s, I think it's the 50s, maybe the 40s, at Coney Island, a doctor set up a display of incubators, the very first incubators for premature babies. And it was so expensive, those were not available to people anywhere. He kept babies alive because he had people buy tickets to see premature babies, but he was able to run the incubators that kept them alive. Children lived because he did that, and people became familiar with the science. So, that's super complicated. Like there is some exploitation in a sense. Certainly the babies had no choice, but it was all out of the goal that if I can educate people, if I can teach people about this, I can make a change. That's a little bit cleaner than, even the situation you bring up. But that's where I get to with these topics is I want everybody to stop and turn it back around. Like you automatically think this way, stop for a second and think about the other way, and then try and think about what your opinion is. I feel like the world would benefit if we would do that across multiple aspects of our lives.
Yeah, I also think with this show that I wasn't really trying to tell anybody what to think either, like how you feel about this. I'm just kind of presenting it to you in a way so that you can form your own opinion on it. So because it can be personal. You can think that it's ethical or not ethical or so many things, but at least we're presenting you with the right information, encouraging you to ask questions so that you can think about it in a deeper way.
Thank you, Annalise, for that question, and thank you both for that very thoughtful response. Are there other questions from our audience? Josie, do you have one? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. So I did see the exhibit, and I had gone through with my daughter, and she's like 5, so she's very curious about bodies and everything, and always saying, really awkward things that I'm trying to figure out how to answer. Just having this talk with you guys is really insightful, and I kind of want to get the book that you're reading because I want to be able to be more of a person that can talk to her about these extraordinary bodies that people have. And so my question was, I am really interested on how you guys did the research. Was the research already at the Ringling, or did you guys have to dive in the library? Like, how are you guys getting these personal stories that were presented on your labels text?
Yeah, so a few of the prints, a few of the performers were actually mentioned in some of these books. So some of that came from these two that I started with, but a majority of it just came from research using books online journal articles that I found already written about this. Pretty much nothing came from the Ringling collection as far as research. Most of it was just me searching every corner of the internet, trying to find these things, finding like letters and accounts, so many accounts of seeing these people exhibited, and flyers and posters and tickets, admissions, all of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, in a sense, it's kind of interesting that not all, but most of the people represented are, their stories have been carried on in a robust way. So it's really easy to find. And that's fascinating because, decades and even centuries after their death, their images are being reproduced and their stories are being republished in book volumes and now in digital form, carrying it forward. Again, that says a lot about us all, doesn't it?
So we have Charlie was able to join us a little bit after the presentation had started, and Charlie just shared a question in the chat. Charlie, do you want to unmute and explain a little bit what you mean by the social model?
Oh, yeah. So there's, I guess in disability activism, there's like the idea that disability is like a social construct based on like how we react to like, essentially disabilities like wouldn't exist. Or I shouldn't say wouldn't exist, but wouldn't be as detrimental. But disabled people are disabled because of the systems don't support them and allow them agency in their lives. If you just look at like all of our disability laws and like how much they suck. So yeah, that's a social model. And there are a lot of different, I guess, models for looking at this. And I think a lot of different people fall on different areas of the spectrum. Some people, advocate highly for it, and some people are like in a mix. But yeah, I should probably link it because I feel like I didn't explain it very well.
No, you're good, and you're right. That's it's that idea that that it's systemic, right? That disability is a systemic issue because the world has grown up around what we consider to be normal bodies. So access for someone who uses a wheelchair could be limited because most people do not need to use a chair to move themselves through the world. So that and that goes for anything that can be identified as a disability. To get to what I think your question is, one of the things that we were looking at, we did talk a little bit about this before you joined us, that extraordinary bodies, where does that title come from? And it's the approach that we've been working with some academic scholars who are dealing with disability studies issues, but framing it a little differently, talking about the variable body, that every single body has a different experience of the world. And if we do that, then we remove these kind of ableist constructs because one doesn't expect any single body to have the same experience as another. Does that kind of get at what you were asking?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's it's really, to me, it's the most exciting and interesting part of all of this is that as a museum that celebrates the circus arts across the board, framing this idea of a variable body means that I can talk about someone in the sideshow within the same kind of voice and construct as I talk about a contortionist or about a trapeze artist, that everyone is on that spectrum of having their own unique physical experience.
Yeah, and also just bringing up and reiterating the fact that normal is considered normal because someone created the parameters for normal, and historically that has been wealthy, white, cis, able-bodied men. And so none of these things would be that extraordinary or that different if that wasn't what we considered the norm. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Charlie.
So I think with that, we will wrap up. I think that's a great note to sort of sum up our conversation for today. I want to thank you so much, Lacie and Jennifer, for your incredible work on the exhibition and this really great conversation. And I do have one last question. You said initially you had hundreds of images online you were sorting through. Will there be another iteration of this show? And how long is it on view for those that haven't yet had the chance to see it?
Those are like the hardest questions you've thrown to me, Laura. I don't know about Lacie's availability. I actually very much would like to do a rotation of this. And I think really use the framing text that Lacie wrote, and just, because of the nature of prints, we can't keep them out too long. So they'll need to be rotated. I don't have a date on the schedule, but realistically, it's going to be this spring after we open the Greatest Show on Earth galleries. And so we'll need to identify a new set, but I would love to frame it exactly as it has been, because I think that it really is just perfectly done in that regard. So Lacie, if you've got free time, we can talk. But
I would love to. But
So,
also,
so hopefully more to come in the future from both of you.
maybe future interns can help you with that as well.
Yeah. I was gonna say, Madison's been on the call. She's working with me on the Greatest Show on Earth gallery and dealing with some of the issues of talking about individual stories. So it's a big theme for me.
All right, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and come visit that exhibition soon. You have until spring, so check it out.
Lacie, thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you, Lacie.
Thank you so much.